Chapter 084. Powerless. Zorian slowly awoke in his bed in Siren. His head was fuzzy, his body hurt all over, and he had trouble remembering what he had been doing in the previous restart. Confused and in pain, he remained lying in bed for a time, fading in and out of consciousness. Gradually, his mind began to clear up and he started to get concerned. Something was wrong. Yeah, he was feeling absolutely terrible, but it was more than that. Something was subtly off about this situation, and it was really starting to bother him. Oh right, it suddenly dawned on him. Kiriel didn't wake me up by jumping on me. I woke up on my own with no one else in sight. That shouldn't be possible unless something has gone very, very wrong. The moment he realized this, it was as if something clicked inside his mind and it all came back to him. The sudden visit of Quatakikal, the theft of the dagger from the royal vaults with his help, the final battle they had against the ancient lich, and the insidious soul attack he used just before the restart ended. The memories flooded into his mind suddenly and without end. The process was forceful and alien, as if something was shoving these thoughts directly into his brain with little regard to his well-being. The waves of pain and nausea radiating from his damaged soul suddenly intensified, and he barely managed to roll himself out of bed before vomiting his guts out all over the floor of his room. Dimly, he was aware that Kiriel rushed inside when he started making noise and then rushed back out screaming for Mother to come and help, but he was in no position to react to that. It took all of his strength just to remain conscious and weather the pain. His soul felt like it was going to split apart, and he instinctively knew that it would be a terrible mistake for him to black out at the moment. He and Zack had long theorized that their souls synchronized somehow with their body at the start of every restart, interfacing with their life force and rearranging their brains to account for the memories they gathered over the restarts. And it looked as if this was true, except that in its current state, it was no longer capable of smoothly completing that process. Without Zorian's conscious efforts to stabilize his soul, it would not only ravage his body and mind but possibly also injure itself further in its fumbling. If he lost consciousness now, who knew when he was going to wake up next? A small, panicked part of his mind feared he had already spent the majority of their remaining restarts in a soul damage-induced coma, but he shoved that thought aside for now. This wasn't the time to worry about that. For now, all he could do was grit his teeth and deal with the problem at hand. He didn't know how much time he spent in that state, shivering on the floor of his room as he fought to stay awake. But eventually Mother and Kiriel rolled him over onto a blanket and carried him off to a guest room to recover in. Somehow he managed to persist through it all until his soul finally calmed down. When he finally recovered enough to talk, he found out that it was still the first day of the restart. He had failed to react when Kiriel came to wake him up, and stayed that way for about 2 hours before waking up. Mother and Kiriel seemed shaken at the severity of his apparent illness, and refused to let him get up and walk around on his own in the aftermath. They also called for a local healer to come and check up on him, which was very annoying yet perfectly reasonable in light of what happened, so he could hardly object to it. Predictably, the healer failed to find anything really wrong with him. He was not a mage, just a local who knew how to recognize common illnesses and hand out appropriate potions in response. He failed to find anything seriously wrong with Zorian, so he simply suggested that they watch him closely for a few days to make sure it didn't happen again. Mother was rather unhappy with his uselessness, but she did seem more at ease after receiving the diagnosis. When they finally left him alone for a while, he decided to chance things and reached into his marker, even though he knew the action would aggravate his soul damage somewhat. He had to know how many restarts they still had left. The marker told him he still had 25 iterations left, which caused Zorian to breathe a sigh of relief. He didn't lose any of the restarts, it seemed. Unfortunately, this was where the good news ended. The damage Quatakikal's last attack did to his soul meant that he was currently completely incapable of casting anything. Attempting to perform even the simplest of shaping exercises caused his soul to radiate waves of pain and nausea throughout his whole body in protest. Though this would go away in time, he estimated it would take at least 3 months before he was back in his top form. Perhaps as much as 4 or 5 months if circumstances forced him to push things and he kept aggravating his injuries. Zorian suddenly realized that he relied on his magic for practically everything these days. He had already forgotten what it was like to be a weak, mundane teenager. Even coming up with a plan for going forward that didn't involve the use of a teleport spell was hard. Damn it. He doubted Zack was any better off than he was, considering he had yet to visit Zorian after so many hours into the restart, so this was pretty much a total disaster. Even though they hadn't spent any of the restarts in a coma, the inability to use magic was going to sharply limit their options in the upcoming restarts. There was no way they would dare approach Silver Lake or Quatakikal with an obviously damaged soul like this, for instance. Additionally, the ancient lich may be able to recognize the soul damage as having been done by himself in some fashion. Zorian had no idea how one would go about doing that, as he found no traces of foreign soul fragments in his soul, but he wasn't a millennia-old lich like Quatakikal. He sighed. He had really underestimated the ancient lich. He probably should have been raging internally at the amount of grief he caused them, but in all honesty, Zorian found himself kind of impressed by the decisiveness and ruthlessness Quatakikal had displayed. It took mere moments for Quatakikal to decide, after seeing Svim's memories, that the time loop was real and that he should sacrifice everything to hit them where it hurt the most. Most people would be doubtful at the information they received or too shocked to think clearly, but Quatakikal didn't hesitate at all to sacrifice his own soul in an attempt to take them down. Zorian could see the logic. Without Zack and Zorian mucking things up, Quatakikal was pretty much guaranteed to get what he wanted out of the invasion of Cyoria, and potentially cooperating with them had little appeal to him. Possibility of betrayal aside, he was a 1,000-year-old lich. What use did he have for a measly decade or two? Still, knowing all of this intellectually and being able to disregard self-preservation in order to pull off a suicide move, those were two entirely different things. Zorian had no idea that a person could detonate the outer layer of one's soul in order to launch a massive suicide attack on the souls of everyone in the vicinity, but even if he did, he would not have expected Quatakikal to use such a maneuver after less than a minute of consideration. Zorian knew that he would be unable to act so boldly if he had found himself in Quatakikal's shoes, and it boggled his mind that a lich, people that are typically obsessed with personal survival at all costs, was able to steel himself into pulling off a suicide move so easily. Well, putting that aside, he suddenly realized he had a tricky problem on his hands. Namely, he had to find a way to convince Mother to let him go to Cyoria so he could check up on Zack. From what he remembered, the last time he failed to wake up in time it was due to the sword diver attack in one of the restarts, and he had to remain in Siren for the rest of the month to make Mother calm down and let him out of her sight. This time the situation looked much worse, and he needed to convince her to trust him far more than she had been willing to the last time around. He could already feel his headache getting worse. Break. It took 2 whole days of constant nagging and arguments before Zorian was able to convince Mother to let him go. He thought about just boarding a train when she wasn't looking, but the look in her eyes made him suspect she would drop everything and follow after him if he tried that. She could be remarkably stubborn that way. Strangely, it was Father who ended up helping him by arguing in his favor. He actually seemed impressed that Zorian was willing to push through his sickness and keep attending classes, and ended up helping him convince Mother to let him go to Cyoria. It was a very surreal experience to Zorian, since he couldn't remember the last time his father took his side or approved of his choices. He didn't know how to feel about that. In any case, Mother eventually relented on the whole issue, though she did insist he take Kiriel with him, so she could keep an eye on him, supposedly. It was amusing to see her pause in surprise when he immediately agreed to her request. The journey was a bit of an unpleasant shock to him. Robbed of his magic and still plagued with phantom pains and tremors, he struggled to carry their luggage and they both ended up getting caught in the rain for a while before they sought shelter in a nearby inn. He ended up renting a tiny, overpriced room for a single night, since the rain wouldn't be stopping anytime soon. Kiriel wouldn't stop complaining about getting wet for nearly an hour and screamed like a baby when she saw a particularly large cockroach crawling along the wall of their room. Being unable to access his vast magic abilities was an unusual and very unpleasant experience. The next day he brought Kiriel to Amaya's place. Thankfully, she did not make too much of an issue out of their arrival, even though Zorian had not arranged for anything with Ilsa in this particular restart. Then he went searching for Zack. He quickly realized this wouldn't be as easy as he imagined. Zack was, he soon found out, officially missing. Tezen Zveri, Zack's legal guardian, was organizing a search for him and called for anyone who had any information about his whereabouts to contact him immediately. That was very familiar. Almost nostalgic, really. It was pretty much the same situation that he had faced during the first few restarts after he got pulled into the time loop. He wondered what that meant. Was this some kind of additional time loop safeguard that kept the controller gone until they recovered, Or was this just Zack's guardian freaking out about finding a comatose Zack and faking a disappearance? Personally, Zorian would bet on the latter. Quite a few people apparently knew how inappropriate Tezen's handling of Novita's affairs was. So if Zack were to fall mysteriously unconscious all of a sudden, he would be one of the prime suspects. Zorian could totally see Tezen fearing that the coma would be blamed on him and faking a disappearance until he can decide what to do, much like Jornak did with Veyers. In any case, it was relatively easy to prove which one of the options was correct. Zack and Zorian both had a marker with an identical key, and Zorian knew a tracking ritual that would let him locate his fellow time traveler with ease. All he had to do now was find someone to help him cast it, because he was currently incapable of doing it himself. Gods, he hated this restart so much. The room was silent. Zorian was supremely calm and collected, staring Svim right in the eyes despite the look of annoyance present on his mentor's face. So let me see if I got you correctly, Svim said. You are a time traveler. You fought a millennia-old lich with Zack in the previous version of this month that I can't remember. Your soul has been damaged, so you conveniently can't demonstrate any of this amazing magic you apparently know, and now you want me to help you rescue Zack from the evil clutches of Tezen, his legal guardian who is secretly behind his recent disappearance, despite organizing a nationwide search for the kid. Zorian considered it for a second. Yes, that's pretty much what I'm saying, he nodded. Get out of my office. Ilsa carefully studied the stack of papers in front of her, one hand propping up her chin while using the other to slowly tap her finger against the desk in a steady rhythm. Zorian patiently waited for her to finish reading. If this didn't work, he would have to take a risk and seek magical assistance through black market channels. Dealing with criminals while being essentially powerless was taking quite a bit of a risk, but there was nothing he could do. He needed to know what was going on with Zack. So all I need to do is cast this spell on you and tell you what the results say? Ilsa eventually asked, giving him a suspicious look. That's right, Zorian nodded. It looks like a tracking spell, she noted. It is a tracking spell, Zorian confirmed. Ilsa raised an eyebrow at him. Dare I ask what it's supposed to track then? She asked. It's kind of personal, Zorian said, doing his best to look depressed and desperate. I'm afraid my friend has gone missing. Please, Miss Lady. You know I'm not a troublemaker student and I don't ask for much. It would mean a world to me if you did this for me. Ilsa snorted derisively at him. You need to work on your acting skills, Mr. Kaczynski, she told him. That aside, I had Professor Chow tell me about a strange little visit from you recently. He was still kind of annoyed that Svim was so unwilling to entertain his claims. Being implausibly good at magic was apparently really important for convincing the man there was something to his crazy time-traveling claims. Well, convincing him quickly in any case. He could probably wear down the man's skepticism with a lot of time and effort, but he didn't want to wait that long to tackle this problem. Is this friend of yours Zack Novita, perhaps? Ilsa tried after he didn't say anything for a while. He could be, Zorian shrugged. Zorian, Ilsa sighed, folding her fingers into a triangle in front of her. Putting aside that I have never really heard of you interacting much with Mr. Novita in the past. What if you're right? What if Zack has really been kidnapped by his caretaker and taken somewhere? I cast the tracking spell and give you the location. What do you do with it? How can an academy student like you handle the guards and the security measures that this place would undoubtedly have and rescue Zack? Zorian internally debated the merits of explaining to her that his plan was to simply hire black market mercenaries to do the parts he himself could not, but eventually decided it was a bad idea. He had no real excuses in regards to where he got all the money needed to hire such people or why he thought he could judge their skills and character well enough to identify which of them are worth hiring and which aren't. You don't have to worry about it, he told her, giving her a reassuring smile. I'm just trying to find a friend. I'm sure it won't be all that difficult. She gave him an unamused look. Yeah, he probably should have just gone to the black market right from the start instead of bothering with this. Contrary to his expectations, though, she didn't just throw him out of her office immediately after. Give me 2 days, okay? She eventually told him. I need to speak with the academy leadership about this. Huh? Zorian said, surprised. I'm not sure I understand. Why would you need to kick this up so high? It's just a tracking spell. And let you get in over your head and disappear as well? I don't think so, Ilsa said. If we're going to do this, we may as well go all the way. Besides, Mr. Novita is a student of our institution. It is well within our rights to try and locate him if he goes missing. She pushed the stack of papers towards him and tapped it a couple of times for emphasis. Now, she said, explain to me how exactly this tracking spell works and why you think it can find Mr. Novita when so many professional diviners have tried and failed to do the same. It was fascinating to watch how quickly and effectively the Academy could mobilize itself when it really cared about something. Perhaps it was because the House Novita had some secret ally among the Academy leadership, or because the Academy saw the whole situation as a chance to score some free reputation points, but they really did assemble a team to go check up on the location Zorian would provide them with. He'd be lying if he said he wasn't a little intimidated by the attention suddenly directed at him. For one thing, he wasn't actually completely certain the tracking spell would work. While he personally didn't think it very likely, it was still possible that Zack's disappearance was really just some sort of time loop safeguard and that he was literally nowhere to be found. It would be quite awkward if that happened. Thankfully, the tracking spell worked just fine. Zack was just outside of Cyoria, in one of the smaller private estates that technically wasn't owned by Tezzin but could be connected to his family if one looked deeper. The group assembled by the Academy immediately stormed the place, presenting official-looking authorization documents when questioned about their motives and identity. There were guards in place, but they were apparently not paid enough to face off against a numerically superior force from a well-known institution, and they quickly decided to stand down and give them free rein. The secret basement Zack was being held in was cunningly hidden, but since Zorian was there to serve as a living tracking device, it was simple enough to find it anyway. Zack was in a soul damage-induced coma, just like Zorian expected him to be. Due to his inability to cast anything including soul diagnosis spells, he couldn't be sure why Zack had ended up in a worse state than he did, but he had his suspicions. Zack's control over his own soul was much weaker and cruder than Zorian's, as was his ability to retain mental discipline. If he woke up early on in the restart like Zorian did and had to fight to stay awake and prevent his soul from going berserk, well, even Zorian found that struggle to be a challenging one. In any case, Zorian was now presented with a new problem. Even though he had been crucial in tracking down Zack, he now couldn't access his unconscious body at all. The discovery of his unconscious body had kicked up a media storm that didn't look like it was going to die down anytime soon, and he had been transferred to an expensive hospital and placed under guard. Zorian was not a family member, nor did he have any other known links to the Novita heir, and many people were suddenly questioning his involvement in all this. The Academy was taking his side for now, but Ilsa told him things were a bit delicate at the moment. Tezzin was trying to distance himself from the matter, bitterly denying he had anything to do with Zack's coma or imprisonment outside of Cyoria, and his faction pushing hard for Zorian to be arrested so he could be vigorously questioned. No matter. Even if Zorian could see Zack, what would he do with his unconscious body? Before he visited Zack in the hospital, he had to figure out how to accelerate his healing. Who knew how long it would take for Zack to wake up if he had to rely on his natural rate of recovery? Fortunately, this was something he could actually tackle with his current abilities. Sudamir, just like many necromancers, often ended up damaging his soul in various ways while training and practicing his craft. As such, he had invested a lot of time in tracking down methods of accelerating his recovery, and Zorian had made sure to steal most of these out of his head during their interrogation sessions. A lot of these were purely personal soul magic exercises that were useful only to the soul mage using them, or complex ritual spells that he wasn't capable of casting right now, but a few actually came in the form of potions that could be administered to others. And alchemy did not require any mana shaping. His inability to do magic did not hold him back here in the slightest. So long as he could track down and buy the appropriate materials, he would be able to create the potions in question. Getting materials for such a relatively exotic potion was anything but easy, of course. Many of them were not sold on the open market, and even if they were, Zorian did not have enough money on him to buy them. He thought about robbing invader caches again, but his lack of magic made that a far riskier proposition than it usually was. Additionally, he had attracted quite a bit of attention to himself lately, so going out for a little midnight stealing was probably unwise. Thus, he ended up amassing the necessary funds the hard way. He bought a bunch of raw materials with his available money, made a handful of rare, hard-to-make potions with them, sold them for money, used that money to buy even more raw materials, and so on. It took him a week of that to get enough money to buy what he actually wanted, and then another 4 days before he had managed to track it all down and finish the potions. The end result was 3 different bottles, one holding a milky white liquid, another a blood-red syrup that looked as if it was constantly boiling, and the last one a glossy pitch-black pill that floated in the center of the bottle as if weightless. He took all three of them and departed in the direction of the hospital that held Zack. He was still not allowed to visit him, but who cared about that? Through a strategic use of sleep bombs and other disabling potions, he managed to gain access to Zack's room, after which he proceeded to force-feed the 3 soul cures to his unconscious body, one after another. He immediately left afterwards. It would take a while for the potions to actually take effect, and it would be best if he were far away from the scene of the crime when people found the trail of unconscious bodies he had left in his wake. Break. The news of the second attack on Zack while he was in the hospital kicked up another round of controversy and several dramatic vows by the hospital staff and city authorities that the perpetrator was going to be caught any day now. Considering that not even Zorian's worst detractors seemed to suspect him as the perpetrator made him rather doubtful of that claim, though. One amusing detail was that the hospital claimed they had caught the attacker in the act and heroically fought him off, which was why Zack supposedly hadn't been hurt more as a result of the break-in. While he waited to see what the result of his intervention would turn out to be, Zorian looked into what had happened to Alanik, since the battle priest was one of the few competent and reliable soul mages he knew of. Sadly, with Zorian being unable to teleport and busy with the whole Zack situation, he never did intervene to save Alanik from Sudamir's assassins, so by the time he checked up on him the man was already dead. Frustrating. It did make him kind of curious how those assassins were even capable of killing someone of Alanik's caliber. Investigating the case a little revealed he was essentially ambushed while sleeping, allowing his attackers to kill him before he even realized what was going on. That kinda made sense, yeah. If Zorian saved Lukav, Sudamir panicked and acted prematurely, trying to kill Alanik through sheer force before Lukav could contact him and tell him someone was killing people like them. If the assassination of Lukav went through without issues, Sudamir would act with due caution and planning and kill Alanik in his sleep. In any case, the treatment worked far better than he had hoped. 4 days after he fed Zack those potions, his fellow time traveler woke up from the coma. Not long after that, he demanded to see Zorian, which pretty much shut down any further attempts to keep Zorian from visiting the hospital. "How are you feeling?" Zorian asked his fellow time traveler. "Like crap," Zack grumbled. He gave Zorian a suspicious look. "I heard you're the one who tracked me down after my asshole caretaker just stuffed my unconscious body down in some basement. I guess I should thank you for that, but how are you so much better off than me? Did you not get caught in the blast or something? You know our conversation is probably being eavesdropped, right?" Zorian asked him. "So, just put up a privacy ward on the room and be done with it," Zack told him. "I can't," Zorian sighed. "I can't really cast anything right now." Zack was quiet for a few seconds. "Ah," he said finally. "I guess you didn't get off as lightly as it appears. You probably don't want to hear this, but that kinda makes me glad. I kind of prefer it when you have to suffer through this crap with me." "Jerk," Zorian said, though there was no real heat in it. Yeah, but seriously, why are you already walking around while I can't even stand up without vomiting all over myself?" "I'm not sure, but do you perhaps remember waking up in your own room for a moment before losing consciousness again?" Zorian asked him. Zack frowned. "It's hard to remember," he said after a few seconds. "Maybe. Well, we're going to have to continue this particular topic when you get out of the hospital," Zorian told him. "Can you estimate how long it will be before you're back in top form?" Zack frowned. "I don't know. For 5 months. Something like that." Zorian breathed a sigh of relief. Although Zack's condition was worse than his own, it would seem it still wasn't too bad. "Is there something urgent you need right now?" Zorian asked him. "As you can imagine, my ability to acquire things is a bit limited at the moment, but I'll do my best. All I want right now is to be out of this damn hospital," Zack grumbled. "But I don't think that's going to happen before the end of the month, considering what I've overheard, and neither of us has the ability to force the issue right now." It was as Zack said. He spent the rest of the restart trapped in the hospital while Zorian had to dodge increasingly insistent questions about his involvement in the Zack affair and his personal activities. Thankfully, before those things could really get anywhere, the summer festival had arrived and the restart came to an end. The next 5 restarts were relatively relaxed. With their souls so heavily damaged and their spellcasting impaired, Zack and Zorian couldn't really do anything particularly dangerous or strenuous, lest their recovery be prolonged even further or their soul damage become permanent. Whether it was Zack or Zorian, they had no choice but to patiently wait for their souls to heal, so they gave up on doing anything serious and decided to just have fun and work on some of their easier skills. A part of Zorian was aghast at taking a break with their time steadily running out as it was, but forcing themselves would gain them little while risking a lot, so he did his best to suppress it. Unexpectedly, having his soul damaged actually ended up being quite a boon to Zorian's skill with soul perception and soul magic in general. It allowed him to map out his soul in far greater detail and enhanced his understanding of how souls generally functioned. There were some things that were very hard to notice when things were going smoothly, and some pieces of the soul were far easier to comprehend when one compared intact and damaged versions of the soul to one another. He knew from reading Sudamir's mind that necromancers often deliberately mutilated other people's souls for that exact reason, destructively studying the anatomy of the soul to enhance their own skills, but one could never really perceive foreign souls on the same level of detail as one could perceive their own. As far as Zorian knew, no soul mage was crazy enough to deliberately damage their own soul as heavily as Zack and Zorian had gotten theirs damaged just to enhance their knowledge of soul mechanics, so their current opportunity was somewhat unique. Although Zack started from a lower level, his skill in regards to personal soul perception also grew by leaps and bounds in this period, since he invested a huge amount of effort into it, much more than Zorian himself. The fact that he had ended up worse in the wake of Quatakikle's soul attack seemed to have affected him greatly. Aside from soul magic, the two of them also worked on their basic shaping skills and tinkered rather heavily with alchemy, since this was the one magical discipline that hadn't been affected by their injuries in the slightest. They didn't try to inform anyone of the time loop during this time. Most of the notebooks and other gathered information had been stored in the palace orb, which they couldn't actually access at the moment. They still interacted with many of the people they previously worked with, but mostly for the sake of fun and hanging out this time. They spent an entire restart diligently going to class, being as helpful as humanly possible to every teacher and student they encountered. They spent a restart shape-shifting into various animals through transformation potions and explored the city and its surroundings through alien senses and perspectives. They dabbled in painting, sculpting, wood carving, drawing, and various art skills. They went on a tour of Eldamar and its neighbors via train and other mundane methods. And when the last of these relaxing restarts was drawing to a close, Zorian realized he wasn't sorry for it at all. Even though they kind of wasted their time, even though they would only have 19 iterations left once this restart was finished, he was at peace with it all. "We really need to give it our all in the upcoming restarts," Zorian said to Zack one day. 19 restarts aren't that much, and we never know when something like this can happen again. If we had gotten this injured with only a handful of restarts left, that would have been the end of us right there. Do you think we should still mess around with Quatakikle after this? Hell yes, Zack said firmly. I mean, yeah, he really got us good this time, but we still haven't figured out a good way to break into the royal vaults without his help. And besides, while he ended up messing us up, he also showed us a really good way of taking him down with relative ease. Oh? Zorian asked curiously. And what would that be? See, I think we've been overthinking things a little, Zack explained. Instead of trying to lure Quatakikle into a trap and flooding him with golems and enemy mages, we should be relying on our strengths to defeat him. Well, your strengths in this case. I'm talking about mind magic, of course. Mind magic? Zorian said, stunned. But with his mind blank on. Svim also had his mind blank on, and it didn't stop Quatakikle, Zack quickly pointed out. It would be tricky, but if we time things right and I get a moment to concentrate properly, I'm pretty sure I can hit the guy with a powerful enough dispel to get rid of his mind blank. Just for a moment, but that should be enough for you, right? I'm quite sure that Quatakikle has some measure of skill with defending his mind, Zorian said carefully. The fact he was able to search Svim's mind so quickly in the heat of battle shows he's quite proficient in mind magic. I don't think he's psychic, and the brief telepathic clash I had with him didn't impress me much. I suppose it could work. It will work, Zack insisted. Your mind magic is terrifying, and I bet it has been centuries since Quatakikle has been targeted by a mind mage he couldn't kill in under a second. So long as we can stop Quatakikle from murdering you before you finish subverting his mind, I think this could work amazingly well. You say that like it's such an easy thing, Zorian sighed. But you're right, that is an interesting idea. Certainly better than fumbling wildly for a solution like we have been doing thus far. I kind of suspect Quattuckikul has rigged his soul to be withdrawn back into his phylactery if his mental defenses are ever seriously breached, though. That's what I'd do in his place. That still means we get to pick up the imperial crown from his abandoned skeleton, though, Zack said with a shrug. That's the only thing we truly need from him. Everything else is just a bonus. Zorian supposed he was right about that. The next restart they decided to spring back to work and get their plans back on track. Their souls were fully healed as far as they could figure out, and they didn't have too much time to waste. Thus they quickly established a simulacrum link to Koth and Zlotic, recovered the palace orb, stole the Pearl of Aranhul, and then boarded their brand new airship and set off towards Blantyre. It would be a long and dangerous journey. Blantyre was the largest of the world's continents, but it was separated by miles and miles of open sea from the nearest human port. Just making sure they stayed on the right path was a problem, since the endless expanse of water provided few clues as to whether or not they were going the right way, and neither Zack nor Zorian were proficient in this kind of navigation. On top of that, the shortest path to the continent, which they pretty much had to take, passed uncomfortably close to a large island inhabited by dragons, hundreds upon hundreds of dragons. It was called, somewhat unimaginatively but accurately, Dragon Island. Dragons generally weren't fond of humanity, and the dragons of the so-called Dragon Island were especially belligerent. They not only killed any human that tried to disembark on the island itself, but actively patrolled the waters around it for any passing ships. If they spotted any, they demanded ruinous tributes in exchange for not destroying the vessel. Zack and Zorian had asked around to see what the dragons found fitting to their tastes and were prepared to pay the tribute for their safe passage. But the airship was very eye-catching, and dragons were known to be capricious at the best of times. It was best to prepare for a fight just in case, and a dragon was always a headache to fight. On top of that, some of the sea monsters were known to be able to attack aerial vessels, firing jets of water and energy attacks at things flying above them. It didn't happen often, and the Pearl of Aranhul usually flew quite high in the air, but it meant that Zack and Zorian could never fully relax and had to be constantly on the lookout for potential problems. Still, things were finally moving again, and that was the important part. They would make the attempt at the dagger and the crown again in this restart, and they would lay down the groundwork for finding the location of the staff as well. In the meantime, they were about to establish contact with Quattuckikul again. It was time to arrange for a trade. Chapter 085. Critical Mass. Zorian would be lying if he said that interacting with Quattuckikul again didn't fill him with dread. Aside from the fact that the ancient lich had reached an unfathomable level of expertise in soul magic and could possibly detect residual damage on their souls, their current trade offer was fundamentally different from what they did during their last interaction with him. Before, it was Quattuckikul who approached them. Last time he had blindsided them with his sudden visit. He had the initiative right from the start, which doubtlessly helped lessen the level of threat he felt from them. This time it would be them who were going to blindside him, and Zorian was not at all sure the ancient lich could take that gracefully. Yet Zorian knew he had to risk it. The fact was, their current initiatives were insufficient. Even if they managed to gather all the keys together in one restart before the time ran out, that wouldn't be enough. Not for Zorian anyway. The problem of how he was supposed to exit the time loop still remained. His original self was still out there in the real world, so he couldn't just order the Guardian of the Threshold to shove his soul into his real body and be done with it. The Guardian of the Threshold may be confused about his controller status, but it would surely notice there was already a soul in Zorian's original body upon trying that. And even if that could be sidestepped somehow, there was still the matter of how to seize control of the body from his original self. Zorian had a couple of ideas on how he could leave the time loop despite this issue, but all of them required incredibly advanced knowledge of dimensionalism and soul magic to accomplish. Quattuckikul had both, and it was likely that the insights he had into those two fields were impossible to find elsewhere. Zorian couldn't afford to ignore this priceless source of information, no matter how dangerous it was. Arranging a meeting with the ancient lich proved to be rather simple, at least. All they had to do was go to the same corner store that Quattuckikul had sent them to the last time they had interacted with him and ask about him. The man behind the counter acted as if they were crazy, but not long after they left, the cephalic rats suddenly became a lot more interested in them and started following them around. Zorian simply kept stealing away the individual rats from the collective for a few days before Quattuckikul decided to contact them personally and arranged for a meeting. At the moment, Zack, Zorian and Quatakikl were sitting in a private booth of a relatively high-class restaurant near the city center. Not exactly the type of institution Zorian liked to frequent, in part because just getting a seat in one of those was pretty hard for an unknown teenager like him, but Quatakikl had been the one to pick the location and he was evidently in the mood to show off his wealth and influence. He was using the same face and flesh and blood look he did the last time they met in a public location. Either this appearance was his usual persona for dealing with people or this was how he once looked before discarding his flesh for an undead existence. What an interesting offer, Quatakikl said, playing around with his fork thoughtfully, occasionally tapping it against his glass. He had ordered an expensive meal and wine for the occasion, but did not touch any of it throughout the entire meeting. I'm no stranger to people seeking me out for my wealth of magical secrets, but usually their offers are hesitant. They're leery of angering a powerful lich, they aren't sure if I am really as good as they heard and they're trying to pay as little as possible to get what they want. They start small, asking for relatively minor things in order to puzzle out how I think and what it would take to get what they really want. The ancient lich then made a dramatic pause, pointing at the small pile of divine artifacts and rare materials that Zack and Zorian brought to him as payment for his wealth of magical secrets, as he put it. You though, Quatakikl continued. You're immediately going for the kill. You want nothing less than my complete pocket dimension creation expertise, an extremely rare, almost priceless set of secrets. And you're willing to offer no less than 5 divine artifacts and a plethora of extremely rare materials in return. I'm impressed by your boldness, but I can't help but wonder. Are you not worried I will cheat you or that this will end up a disappointing trade in the end? You are, after all, trading physical goods for information of uncertain value. I could easily just ignore you after pocketing the goods or play dumb and give you mere shadow of what you asked for. Zorian mentally agreed with this but wasn't really worried. Although many things about the ancient lich were enigmatic, he was pretty sure he had a good read on his sense of honor. Quatakikl prided himself on his sense of fairness. He would not cheat them unless he thought they were trying to cheat him first. The real challenge was to make him agree to the deal in the first place. Although I don't dare claim I know you, you are as famed for your honorable behavior as you are for your great magical skill and brutality in warfare, Zorian said. Quatakikl smiled idly, clearly viewing all 3 traits as a compliment. We feel that if we can reach an agreement with you, you will do your best to honor it. Perhaps my knowledge of pocket dimensions isn't as extensive as you think it is, though, Quatakikl pointed out. I am indeed a man of many talents, but that is quite a rare and exotic field of study. You may end up disappointed by the results of the trade. If so, we will accept it quietly and in good grace, Zorian shrugged. We're willing to take a gamble. Although it is not a smart thing to admit such a thing in these kinds of negotiations, I feel you are being a little too reckless here, Quatakikl noted thoughtfully, giving them both a piercing look as if trying to see through their souls. It would have been smarter to try and do a smaller trade at first just to see if my pocket dimension skills are worth the more substantial investment. Well, said Zack with a cheeky smile. Although this is generally not a smart thing to admit in these kinds of negotiations, the fact is we're in a bit of a hurry. Slowly feeling you out and haggling over the details would take too long. That's why the terms we offered you were so generous, see? Generous? Debatable, Quatakikl scoffed. I was merely questioning your logic just now. I said nothing about how good the deal appears to me. What you are seeking is pretty damn valuable. Yes, but so is our payment, Zack immediately shot back. We realize that reaching out to you so suddenly and asking for such a heavy favor is a bit unreasonable. We also realize that, being in a bit of a hurry, we are innately in a disadvantaged position compared to you. We're on a time limit, you aren't. That's why we're willing to offer as much as we did. Though, in normal circumstances, we would never consider this a reasonable trade. Quatakikl stared at them for a few seconds. Perhaps he was trying to put pressure on them through silence to see how they would react? You're pretty interesting people, Quatakikl said. I think that's why I haven't simply told you to screw off by now. That's what I'd normally tell people if they tried to give me this kind of deal. Are you really teenagers? You are way too calm for people that are supposed to be, 15 years old. Why bother even asking? Zack challenged. We already know you've tried to spy on us before inviting us here, so you probably know enough about us to answer this yourself. I do know some basic facts about you too, Quatakikl admitted. It's just that they don't make much sense. How the hell did 2 Academy students gather all this and find out how to contact me? Who are you really? It's a secret, Sorian said blandly. There was no point in trying to explain. But since we're asking private questions about one another, let me ask you a question of my own. How exactly did you talk no less than 4 cephalic rat swarms into working under you? What the hell did you offer them to make them open to cooperation? I can't even get them to talk to me, much less work for me. Heh. Are we including that information as part of our deal? Quackle asked with a grin. No, Sorian snorted derisively. I was just curious. And also changing the subject, Quackle noted. But fine, I get it. If you want to keep your true identity secret, I won't pry. But you know, if you really are as young as you appear, then we have another problem on our hands. Namely, I'm not sure if you're even capable of learning how to perform dimensional magic on the level you are asking about. What makes you think you are qualified to learn from me? That is not an issue, Sorian insisted. We know we can perform this level of magic because we are already capable of creating pocket dimensions. Oh, Quackle said a little incredulously. Yes, Sorian confirmed. They would have to be careful not to make themselves look too amazing, or else Quackle might notice something was wrong and attack them again. But this particular bit of information was impossible to hide, considering what they were asking of him. We are asking you for advanced guidance, not asking you to teach us the basics of the field. Sorian then removed a bracelet from his wrist and handed it to the ancient lich, who gracelessly snatched it out of his outstretched hand and began to scrutinize it. The bracelet was something Sorian had personally created before coming here. It served as an anchor for a miniature pocket dimension. The internal space was tiny, barely enough to store a book or two, but that wasn't important. The important thing was that it proved that not only were they capable of creating pocket dimensions, they could create advanced ones. Most products of pocket dimension magic came in the form of boxes, chests and other rigid containers that had their internal volume expanded beyond what their outside form would suggest. These kinds of objects were relatively easy to make, as anchoring a pocket dimension to an internal space of a hollow, inflexible object was a relatively simple task. Well, as much as any pocket dimension creation could ever be easy anyway. A more advanced procedure was to use dimensional magic to expand the interior of more flexible containers like bags, backpacks and pockets. Although this sounded rather convenient, fabric was relatively fragile and hard to imbue with spell formula. After a few years of use at most, such objects inevitably fell apart, sometimes causing catastrophic failures when least expected. Finally, there were objects like the palace orb and the bracelet that Quackle was currently holding. These objects were not containers with expanded interior at all. They were self-contained pocket worlds anchored to an object. Accessing the contents of such a self-contained space was tricky without dimensional magic, which drastically reduced the amount of people that could use them, but they were incredibly stable. They could be inflated to downright ridiculous sizes, if one had a sufficiently stable anchor object, as the palace orb amply proved. The bracelet Sorian cobbled up in the last few days was pretty underwhelming in that regard, but he was sure that Quackle would recognize what it signified nevertheless. After a minute or so of silent study, Quackle handed the bracelet back to Sorian and then unceremoniously drew all the divine artifacts and exotic materials towards him with a sweep of his hand. After a few quick movements, they all disappeared into his pockets. Neither Zack nor Sorian moved to stop him. All right, Quackle said with a small nod. You win. I accept the deal. Since you have said you were in a hurry and I'm going to be busy with something soon, we can start tomorrow. Busy with something? What a funny way to hide the fact he was planning an invasion of the city and the release of the primordial trapped in the hole. Still, Zack and Sorian were pretending not to know about that in this restart, so they said nothing about that. After arranging for their next meeting place and hammering out some minor details, they turned to leave only for the lich to stop them. One more thing, Quackle said. Who messed up your souls so badly? Sorian couldn't help but jolt a little at the question. What? He asked. Your souls are scarred, Quackle said matter-of-factly. The damage is faint now and will probably go away completely in a few years, but less than a year ago you must have been in an absolutely miserable condition. A normal person would take years recovering from something like that. Much of it would be spent comatose too. I guess I should add soul magic to the list of things you are inexplicably proficient in. Damn it. So he could detect it. though it didn't look like he recognized it as something inflicted by him in particular. Does it matter? Zack challenged. No, I guess not, Quetzalcoatl said, frowning. But it makes me even more certain you are not really who you present yourself as. You are fortunate I have something else occupying my attention at the moment, or else I would not be as willing to let this go so easily. Make no mistake, though, once I've cleared up my schedule a little, I'll come back to visit you so we can clear some things up. Zorian did not outwardly react to this proclamation, but inwardly he was breathing a sigh of relief. No doubt Quetzalcoatl meant this as a veiled threat, but so long as nothing happened within the bounds of the time loop, Zorian didn't really care about that. Provided they didn't mess up in some other way as the restart developed, they should be fine. Hopefully Silverlake would take his warnings not to investigate into Quetzalcoatl more seriously this time around. Break. Whether because Quetzalcoatl didn't know that they were aware of the invasion this time around, or because he never discovered just how expansive their activities around the region really were, the Lich didn't seem to view them as very threatening this time around. They were kind of baffling, yes, but he had an invasion to organize and he had no idea he had a time limit when it came to figuring them out. In regards to his obligations, he fulfilled them to the letter. The agreement called for him to provide them with instructions for 2 hours every day, and he was never late for the arranged time, nor did he stay so much as 1 minute longer than they agreed. If he withheld some of his expertise, it was in a way that neither Zack nor Zorian could tell the difference. The amount of information he had for them was enough to keep them busy for quite a while. He spoke clearly and understandably. He readily clarified his statements if he saw they did not understand him. He pointed out any obvious mistakes they did under his supervision and explained the logic behind his instructions rather than let them figure things out for themselves. He never lost patience with them or insulted them. He was, strangely enough, probably the best teacher Zorian had ever encountered. Realizing that a soul-defiling, warmongering, 1,000-year-old Lich was his ideal academic instructor was a somewhat unnerving realization for Zorian. That aside, having Quetzalcoatl's dedicated help in understanding pocket dimension magic made Zorian suddenly aware that it wasn't just the lack of qualified teachers and instruction manuals that was holding him and Zack back from advancing quickly in the field. Embarrassingly enough, it often happened that Quetzalcoatl was pushing ahead in his lessons and the two of them struggled to follow along. To put it bluntly, the real bottleneck to making the most out of those lessons was their own lack of talent and comprehension, not Quetzalcoatl's unwillingness to instruct them to the best of his ability. Zorian had a feeling the ancient Lich was laughing at them on the inside about that. Zorian knew this kind of result was to be expected. It wasn't that Zack and Zorian were stupid or that their work ethic was lacking, it was just that they lacked any special advantage when it came to learning something like pocket dimension magic. They had no special talent or bloodline related to the field, and neither of them was the kind of genius that could easily grasp the complexities of this relatively mind-bending, unintuitive field of study. There was little that could be done to speed their learning process up, at least through traditional methods of advancement. So Zorian turned to non-traditional methods instead. For a while now he had been hesitating about delving deeper into the field of mental enhancements he had been messing with, afraid that he would permanently mess up his own mind in the process. Now he decided to risk it and ordered his simulacrums to kick things up a few levels. Aware that time was steadily running out, they did not complain much and simply jumped at the task with enthusiasm that honestly surprised him. He supposed that since he himself had set aside his fears and resolved to tackle the issue, they inherited his determination as well, unlike in the past, where he himself had viewed the endeavor with apprehension, and thus his simulacrums had been similarly unenthused about risking themselves. For the moment his idea was to try and create a sort of mental calculator and internal clock, since a lot of the problems with pocket dimensions came from the inhuman timing and precision required to pull off certain stages successfully. Normally this was achieved via a complex system of divination magic, which added an extra layer of complexity to an already tricky task. If he could strip away the divination scaffolding and just do all the number crunching measurements and timing decisions purely in his head, the magic would get significantly easier. Of course, it turned out to be not that easy. While Zorian knew that creating a mental calculator was very much possible, since it was one of the more common modifications Arania tinkered with, it was a tricky thing to pull off in practice. Several of his simulacrum had to be forcibly broken out of their experiments after they fell into strange mental states, endlessly counting the number of pebbles around them and such. Thankfully, None of them were so far gone that they had to be destroyed and recreated, so they were able to learn from their mistakes instead of starting from scratch and trying to guess where their predecessors made a mistake. Additionally, he was also experimenting with hyper-focused mental states and with trying to replicate the Hydra's unity of self with his simulacrums. He had a feeling that if he could synchronize himself with a handful of his own simulacrums the way a Hydra could synchronize its multiple minds into one self, many complex pieces of magic would become relatively trivial to perform. Of course, these kind of mental enhancement were only of possible benefit to Zorian, and did not help Zack in any way. For this reason, and also because he wanted to hedge his bets, Zorian also started to look more closely into blood magic and enhancement rituals. After all, some creatures were innately good at dimensionalism in various forms. Phase spiders, for instance, were capable of instinctively creating small pocket dimensions to hide themselves in. Blink toads could teleport short distances, void-souled deer could bend space around them to make spells and projectiles launched at them miss, and the silverstripe mole was rumored to be able to perceive dimensional cracks and boundaries in some strange fashion. It might be worthwhile to try and steal those kinds of abilities for a while, just to see if they could offer them with some kind of important insight or capability. Of course, Zorian was currently not very well versed in either blood magic or regular enhancement rituals, so he would first have to practice with something relatively simple and then slowly work his way up to what he wanted. Alternatively, he could just hire an alchemist to make him an enhancement potion with desired ability, but such enhancement potions did not confer the sort of instinctive competence with the gained ability that a properly executed enhancement ritual did. In any case, both the mental enhancement route and the blood magic route were long projects. It would be at least a couple of restarts before he could make an effective use of them, maybe more. Thus, Zorian ended up turning to something more immediate to get the most out of Quatakikle's teachings: his spell formula expertise. Zorian knew for a while now that most old, experienced diviners had specialized divination compasses they used to perform their work. Zorian himself rarely bothered with them, preferring to simply dump information straight into his mind and sort it out mentally, but he had tinkered with such devices often enough in the past. Kerma's divination flower thingy and the spell formula crafters she referred him to were especially useful in this regard. Now he embarked on a project to create such a divination compass, one specialized in figuring out divination related to dimensionalism and pocket dimension creation. In this, at least, he had plenty of success. Spell formula were one of the things he had focused on pretty heavily throughout his entire time in the time loop, and he had reached an extremely high level of skill when it came to them. Producing a working version of such a dimensionalism-specific divination compass took only 2 days, after which he rapidly improved the design, producing newer and more potent versions every couple of days. By the time the end of the restart was approaching, these divination compasses had become so good that Quatakikle took notice of it and commissioned a couple of them for his own use. In exchange, he provided them with the names and locations of 2 secretive mages that also knew a thing or two about pocket dimension magic. Information that was almost as priceless as Quatakikle's own lessons as far as Zack and Zorian were concerned. Gradually, the end of the restart started to approach. Break. While trying to deepen their understanding of pocket dimension magic consumed most of their energies in this particular restart, it was far from being the only thing they worked on. An equally critical, though far more boring task was to make sure the Pearl of Aranhal reached Blantyre safe and intact. A mission that was thankfully far easier than they had ever hoped it would be. No sea monsters bothered them, and while no less than 3 dragons spotted them as they flew near the Dragon Island, they were surprisingly easy to keep at bay with flashy combat spells and a single experimental, magic-enhanced cannon that Zorian had installed on the ship. Neither the spells nor the cannon actually did any damage to the dragons in question, but they kept the beasts from simply rushing at them and ripping the hull into shreds. Perhaps because they had never seen an airship like theirs and did not know what combat abilities to expect from it, all 3 of the dragons limited themselves to probing attacks and flying in circles around them for a few hours to see if their response times and attentiveness would ever slip up. It helped that each of the dragons attacked alone. Only after one of the dragons had given up on bothering them would the next one try his luck. If all 3 of them had united against them, Pearl of Aranhal would have been doomed without question. Thankfully for them, dragons were notoriously solitary creatures that viewed their own kind largely as competition rather than kin. They lived and hunted alone, only forming societies if pressured to do so by outside aggression. Zorian had heard there had been a few ill-considered campaigns in the past that sought to systematically wipe out dragons in a particular area, only for the dragons in question to temporarily amass themselves into massive flocks that devastated everything around them for a while before eventually breaking up again when they were certain the danger was gone. Aside from that, dragons were largely an individual threat, and dragons of Dragon Island were no exception. Unfortunately, while their journey had not been delayed by dragons and sea monsters, their own lack of navigational skill had lengthened the journey somewhat. Additionally, while the people who made Pearl of Aranhal were world-class experts, it was still a prototype that had never really been tested or truly finished before being sent on such an ambitious journey, meaning that it had almost broken down several times along the way, almost crashing them into the sea at one point and forcing them to drastically slow down at several points along their chosen route. But in the end they made it. 5 days before the restart was about to end, the Pearl of Aranhal finally spotted the shores of Blantyre. 5 days was not enough to really do anything, though. If they had to go through this kind of lengthy, annoying journey in every single restart, only to be left with measly 5 days per restart to locate the Imperial staff, they were guaranteed to fail. Thus, their first and very urgent priority was to locate a Bakura gate somewhere on the continent. Any Bakura gate, really. That way they could reach the continent in only a handful of days with the help of Silent Doorway adepts in subsequent restarts. Sadly, this was not an easy task. Bakura gates were scattered all over Blantyre, but the continent was vast and the gates were small. Searching for them blindly would take forever, which meant they had no choice but to seek the natives for help in finding them. The trouble was, Blantyre was not inhabited by humans. The steaming equatorial jungle that covered Blantyre was home to a multitude of sapient species, but the most advanced and powerful force were the lizard men. They lived in great stone cities along the coast and the rivers, and although they were very awfully primitive by human standards, they were more or less the only ones qualified to help Zack and Zorian locate a Bakura gate somewhere around here. Not only were they the only species on Blantyre that kept any sort of written records, they also regularly traded with humans from Zlotic and Altazia, which meant that some of them actually spoke a language that Zack and Zorian could understand. Unfortunately, while the lizard men did occasionally trade with humans, getting the location of a nearby Bakura gate out of them was still a huge chore. For one thing, they existed as a collection of small kingdoms and quarreling city-states that rarely shared information with one another, so unless a Bakura gate was literally in their territory, there was no chance they would know about such a strange but ultimately useless artifact. For another, only the priesthood was literate and knowledgeable of obscure places and artifacts like these, and they were not terribly fond of outsiders. Finally, while the lizard men did occasionally trade with humans, they did so with great caution and only in a strictly regulated manner. If they wanted information, they couldn't just walk into a lizard man city and start asking questions. They had to go through official channels and make a formal request. Pressed for time as they were, Zack and Zorian resorted to shock and awe to get what they want. Rather than carefully approaching the local rulers and making respectful diplomatic requests for information about Bakura gates, they brazenly flew Pearl of Aranhal straight above the nearest lizardman city, teleported themselves into the city center and then started throwing around gold, gems and some spices that they heard lizardmen liked at everyone in the vicinity until someone came to talk to them, at which point they promised great rewards for any information about the Bakura gates. Then they moved on and repeated this process in every larger city they encountered as they flew around the coast. The reaction was everything they hoped it would be. The lizard men may be primitive, but they had their ways, and news of their airship and what they were seeking quickly spread to every lizard man power in the vicinity. Soon, everyone knew that 2 immensely powerful human mages were flying around in their fancy airship and promising fantastic rewards to anyone who could lead them to a Bakura gate. Admittedly, this did cause a lot of the lizardmen to come forward with fabricated tales of nearby Bakura gates, but those were easily seen through by Zorian. Lizardmen emotions were not alien enough to give Zorian's empathy too much trouble. Eventually, 3 days later, they were summoned by one of the local kings from a river city-state deeper in the continent's interior. The emissary brought with him a very lifelike drawing of a Bakura gate as proof that they were telling the truth, which was good enough for Zack and Zorian to immediately set out towards the place. This was why, at the moment, the 2 of them were standing in a luxurious stone throne room of a lizardman king, curiously observing their surroundings while they waited for the king to actually arrive and talk to them. Lizardmen rulers seemed to be fond of mosaics made out of gems and colored stones, and this one was not an exception. The walls were dominated by some kind of epic battle scene between two lizard men forces. One of the two sides, which Zorian presumed to represent the forces of the city they were currently in, was clearly dominating their opponents, boldly advancing forward, while the other was in the process of being pierced by spears, clubbed over the head by heavy clubs or down on their knees and begging for mercy. An absolutely giant lizard man floated in the sky above the scene, curiously observing the battle. Probably a representation of one of the lizard man gods. Zorian's idle musings were interrupted by the loud entrance of the lizard man king. A procession of musicians playing some kind of annoying flute-like instruments came first, playing ear-splitting whistles while a bunch of lizard men children ran around and threw petals on the ground in front of the approaching king. The lizard man throne guards, which had been leaning on their spears and chatting amongst themselves in their incomprehensible lizard man tongue, quickly assumed a proper posture and pretended they had been alert and battle-ready all this time. They also banged their spears against the floor a few times and let loose a keening wail that was probably some kind of salute. As for Zack and Zorian, they just stared at the spectacle, not sure how to react. Perhaps because they had arrived so unexpectedly, or because those rulers had not been so wealthy and powerful as this one, but this was not the way the other lizardmen kings had behaved in front of them. What's the proper procedure for greeting a lizardman ruler again? Are we supposed to bow or shake hands or something? Zack whispered to him uncertainly. Why are you asking me? Zorian protested. Your nobility, not me. You should be the one who knows things like this. Please, Zack scoffed. You're the one who is constantly interacting with various talking monsters. This is totally your area of expertise. Zorian turned his attention to the approaching king. He was surprisingly short compared to the warriors scattered around his palace, though the massive gem-encrusted headdress and glittering golden jewelry hanging off of him immediately marked him as the ruler regardless. In one of his hands he carried a black staff with a large, glowing amber stone affixed on top. Four particularly massive lizardman warriors flanked him on both sides, which made for a somewhat amusing contrast between them and their king. What was not so amusing was the look in their eyes and the emotions they were radiating. Unlike the normal palace guards, these four took their jobs very seriously, and their yellow-slitted eyes followed them with a threatening intensity. If they made so much as a threatening movement, they were ready to shove a spear through their throat without warning. Also accompanying the king was another lizardman with lots of jewelry and an elaborate headdress, although one less impressive and of slightly different type and color scheme. Zorian suspected that he was pretty sure it was a female lizardman, was the high priest of the city. And though she wasn't as overtly hostile as the king's honor guard, she clearly did not like them at all. Zorian inwardly sighed. Of course, nothing could ever be easy. Zack and Zorian had already managed to claim the imperial ring from the Ziggurat of the Sun in the past. Since they now knew that it was held by the Solrotham high priest, getting it was slightly easier than it had previously been, when they had yet to even locate where it was. However, easier didn't mean easy. The Solrotham high priest resided in the innermost, most heavily defended portion of the Ziggurat. Getting to him still required a large-scale assault on the Solrotham settlement, which was non-ideal. Rather than organize another assault on the Ziggurat of the Sun in this restart, Zorian agreed to try something different this time around. After establishing a base near the Ziggurat using Bakura gates, they brought over a dozen or so Iranian mercenaries and instructed them to spy on Solrotham guards and patrols. Although Solrotham mines were as alien to the Irania as they were to Zorian, the Irania were far more experienced with making sense of alien mines than he was. They did it all their lives after all. At the same time they began ambushing and killing Solrotham hunting parties and patrol groups leaving the Ziggurat, in the hopes that doing this continually would eventually force the high priest to confront them directly, or at least motivate to Solrotham to try and negotiate with them. After all, the colony would surely starve if they couldn't send anyone outside without them disappearing, right? Unfortunately, the Solrotham didn't behave like they hoped they would. Rather than investigate the problem, they simply barricaded themselves inside and no longer tried to leave the Ziggurat. It was baffling. Either the colony had sizable stockpiles of preserved food and felt certain they could last for a while under siege, or there was a dungeon entrance somewhere below the Ziggurat and they decided to brave the tunnels to feed themselves instead. Either way, it was annoying. Thankfully, the Irania were somewhat successful in their information gathering. So, Zorian asked the Irania in front of him. I don't think the damn wasps are going to poke their heads out of their turtle shells anytime soon. Do you have something useful to report? I think so, yeah, Storm Dream, the Arania in question, answering him through a voice spell so Zack could hear her too. First of all, the ring you're after? It's not an accident that the High Priest has it on him. He knows what it does and is actively using it. Now that I think about it, that does make sense, Zorian mused. I could tell the last time we met that he's a soul mage. That was a bit unusual, since Solrotham aren't exactly known for their magic abilities, but I thought nothing of it at the time. Since he's wearing a ring that grants soul sight, though, I guess it's to be expected he became interested in that type of magic. We're fortunate he didn't populate the ziggurat with undead guards or something. Probably wouldn't happen even if he knew how to do that, Storm Dream said. They're very religious and they seem to attach great importance to being cremated upon death. Some nonsense about returning to the Sun Mother, and whatnot. Well, they should be happy about all those patrols we fireballed to death recently then, Zack said cheekily. They got a proper burial as they died. Yes. Well, Storm Dream said after a second of awkward silence. If you want to lure the High Priest out of the ziggurat, I have only two ideas. One is to wait for him to come outside on his own to perform one of his periodic land blessings and reading of the signs. The next such occasion should be about 2 months from now and... Too long, Zack immediately said, shaking his head. I don't understand why you're in such a hurry about this. The ring has been in the High Priest's hands for years now. It's not going anywhere, Storm Dream said with no small amount of exasperation. But fine. The other option is to try and ally yourself with the nearby Solrotham tribe that this particular bunch has a rivalry with. I'm not entirely sure, but I think he would come out of the ziggurat and support his warriors if he thought it was a rival tribe attacking them instead of scary human mages with their unfair, mysterious magic and thunder sticks. Ah, nodded Zorian. The thought of seeing if the tribe had any local enemies and allying with them had honestly didn't even occur to him. A silly mistake in retrospect. Zack and Zorian discussed the merits of the idea for a while, before Zorian noticed that Storm Dream was shifting in place uncomfortably and looked like she wanted to say something more. What? He asked her. It's probably just a stupid coincidence, but the Solrotham High Priest has the same kind of knife you do, she said. Pie knife? Zorian asked incredulously. Since when did he even carry a knife? Oh. You mean this? He tapped the knife hanging from his backpack. It was the divine artifact they had recovered from the palace orb, the one they had no idea what it did. Zorian sometimes liked to inspect it, staring at it while futilely hoping he would finally succeed in unlocking its mysteries. Yes, like that one, Storm Dream said. I know you humans churn out thousands of identical objects as a matter of course, but I thought it was strange that a Solrotham High Priest on another continent carries the same kind of knife like you do. Especially since their one is of immense religious importance to them and has an impressive magical ability. Oh, do tell, Zack prompted. What magical ability? The High Priest can use it to command a sandworm of immense size hidden beneath the sands of this place, Storm Dream said. It could be just more superstitious nonsense, I guess, but I don't think so. Maybe the Solrotham are overstating the worm's real size, but they seem pretty certain of its ability to repel all intruders. So it should be pretty impressive. If your knife is the same, then maybe you can control it too. Zack and Zorian were silent for a moment. I knew it was stupid, Storm Dream said. Just forget I said anything. Zorian thought about the gigantic flying sandworm they had faced in their last assault on this place. The creature was an immense threat, only kept manageable by Zack's incredible combat prowess and their extensive preparations before the battle. And the way its mind had completely stopped Zorian's mental abilities like a brick wall, unlike any other mental defense he had ever seen. Are you thinking what I'm thinking? Zack asked him quietly. I doubt our dagger can really control the Solrotham sandworm, Zorian said. But it's too bad that we already killed the giant hydra guarding the palace orb, I'll say that much. It was just a suspicion, but Zorian felt it was likely that each knife was keyed into a different creature. Assuming that the strange flying sandworm was the divinely enhanced guardian of the Imperial Ring, it made sense that a knife that the Solrotham probably found near the ring was keyed to it. By the same logic, the knife Zorian currently held in his hand was probably meant to control the Hydra instead, since it normally seemed to live in and guard the orb. Next time then, said Zack dreamily. I like the idea of having my own pet Hydra, you know? We could pit it against the stupid sandworm while we tackle the Solrotham ourselves. Or we could throw him at Quatakikl just to see the look on that stupid bag of bones when a massive hydra starts screaming and charging at him. Or just take it on a walk through Cyoria like some kind of oversized dog and just soak in the people's reactions. Lots of potential there. Zorian looked at the dagger in his hand and then grasped it tightly. Next time indeed. Break. As the end of the restart began to approach, Zack and Zorian turned their attention to something they had been gradually building up to throughout the entire restart. Raiding the royal vaults for the dagger again. They sought out Quatakikl for help again too, partially because they still hadn't grasped the details on the inner wards, so his help in getting inside was still critical, and partially because they still had designs on his crown. Zorian had to admit he was more morally conflicted about betraying Quatakikl this time around. After all, the ancient lich had been nothing but helpful throughout the entire restart. It felt wrong, dishonorable to just stab him in the back like this in the end. Then again, didn't Quatakikl indicate during that initial negotiation they had with him that he would return to interrogate them after his little invasion business was over? Perhaps he was just looking for excuses to make himself better. But seen in that light, this attack could easily be viewed as preemptive defense on their part. Plus, the lich clearly intended to invade Cyoria as normal, a fact he sometimes cryptically alluded to during his lessons, but one which he never actually made clear to them. In a very real way, that was betrayal as well. He supposed in the end it didn't matter. Quatakikl once again agreed to help them steal the dagger from the Eldamar's royal vaults. They once again achieved their goal, successfully fought their way out of the capital city and then kept running from the Eldamar military until Quatakikl figured out the nature of the tracking device that was used to track them. They again opened a dimensional gate to Zlotic and stepped through it. The moment Quatakikl followed after them, they shut off the gate and attacked him with no warning. There was no talking. They attacked silently and without hesitation, and Quatakikl took their ambush entirely in stride. As an endless barrage of incinerating rays, impossibly sharp dimensional blades and disintegration blasts suddenly rained down on him, he quietly blocked, dodged, teleported and retaliated in return. He did not rage at their betrayal or try to talk to them to find out their reasons. Perhaps he had been expecting it. Maybe he was just that used to sudden ambushes. Whatever the case, he silently accepted their challenge and met their attack head-on. The desert quaked. Sand was melted and turned to glass over and over. Several hidden wards and traps that Zack and Zorian prepared in the area in advance activated, only to be shattered and neutralized by Quatakikl. The ancient lich summoned a bunch of skeletal undead giants from some internal storage space on his person, and Zorian responded by throwing his combat golems at them to keep them busy. Zack managed to shear off Quatakikl's leg with one of his attacks, but the lich simply reattached it in the next moment. 3 of Zorian's simulacrums sacrificed themselves to keep him alive when facing Quatakikl's counterattacks, their inhumanly tough metallic bodies unable to withstand the ancient lich's attacks. It was then, right in the middle of the heated battle, that several hidden devices revealed themselves in the distance, blanketing the whole area with small, fast-moving silver discs. Most of the silver discs were completely mundane, meant purely to mask the real threats. Some of them were infused with specialized magic meant to stress and overload typical force shields that protected mages against physical projectiles. And finally, a small number were special. They were infused with the same sort of soul-severing magic that was once used by Kael to make the coin that ended up banishing Quatakikl back to his phylactery. In order to make sure Quatakikl couldn't simply push away all the discs with a simple wave of his hand, Zack and Zorian immediately intensified their attacks. Despite that, Quatakikl took the little silver projectiles as a deadly threat, never letting a single one touch him, raising the ground as walls and pillars to keep them at bay when the shield disruptors started to eat away at his magical shields. But the silver discs did their job of occupying his attention anyway. So busy was he with avoiding them, dealing with Zack and Zorian's normal attacks and trying to counterattacks, that he overlooked a far larger silver disc hidden in the sands nearby. This disc was also imbued with soul-severing magic and with a much more potent form of it, too. Upon dodging one of their attacks, Quatakikl ended up stepping on it and it visibly discharged a wave of white light straight into him. For a moment, the whole battlefield stilled. Quatakikl was momentarily frozen in place, a look of surprise on his face. Zack and Zorian waiting with bated breaths to see if the lich would collapse into a lifeless pile of bones in the aftermath. And then the lich moved. "Hey," Quatak said, speaking up for the first time since the battle had started. "You got me. But do you really think a stupid trick like that can beat me? Well, no. He did not think that. But as a distraction it worked better than Zorian had ever hoped it would. The moment Quatakikal had finished talking, a massive wave of dispelling energy erupted out of Zack, powered by most of Zack's remaining mana. It washed away everything in the vicinity, completely catching Quatakikal off guard. For just a moment all of his defenses went down, including his mind blank. Zorian immediately reached out with his mind and began his attack. Quatakikal's mental defenses were impeccably made. They were thick and without any obvious flaws, and he could rebuild them in an instant just like Svim. Considering his endless reserves of mana, this meant that even Zorian would fail to break through them if he tried to gradually wear them down. He could never hope to win a battle of attrition against the ancient Lich, not to mention that every second he failed to break through was a second that Quatakikal could use to murder his fleshy body to remove the mental threat he posed. Thus, Zorian held nothing back when attacking the Lich. He poured all of his mana into a quick succession of telepathic attacks. After 3 such attacks he was delighted to see some actual exploitable flaws starting to appear. Quatakikal was proficient enough in fixing the aftermath of a single mental attack, but multiple ones in succession strained his defenses. As powerful as he was, the ancient Lich had probably not encountered a mind mage that could meaningfully threaten him for a very, very long time. His defenses had probably once been truly flawless, but since he had not had to use them in ages he had gotten a bit rusty. Too rusty to stop Zorian in any case. With one final push, Quatakikal's mental barrier shattered into countless pieces, leaving his mind defenseless before Zorian's telepathic might. Letting loose an ear-splitting scream of incoherent rage, Quatakikal swung his skeletal hand towards Zorian, firing a jagged red ray in his general direction. Zorian did not stop. Even when the ray hit him, severing his left arm just below the shoulder and sending waves of incredible pain throughout his whole body, he did not stop. He sank deeper and deeper into Quatakikal's mind, paralyzing his skeletal body and starting to root through his long-term memories. Without warning, the mind Zorian was invading suddenly disappeared. The bones Quatakikal had been animating fell to the ground, lifeless. The Lich had admitted defeat and fled. "Ha! We did it," yelled Zack breathlessly. "Oh man, I can't believe we actually succeeded in beating this stupid bag of bones." "Oh shit. Zorian, your arm." "Why yeah, I know," Zorian said, looking at the mangled stump connected to his left shoulder. "I'm not feeling too well. I think I'm going to lie down a little." Zack was saying something, but Zorian could no longer hear him. Everything was kind of fuzzy and eventually he just closed his eyes and let himself fall to the ground. 2 hours later, Zorian had woken up from unconsciousness only to find Zack beside him and his wound professionally bandaged. It was just something he had learned while learning medical magic, Zack explained. Apparently his teachers had insisted he learn some good old-fashioned mundane care for the injuries, and lost limbs were included in these lessons. So now Zorian would get to experience what it was like to live with a missing arm for a few days. Lovely. The time loop was a gift that just kept on giving. In any case, they had to move fast. Quatakikal was bound to be utterly furious with them, and they weren't really sure how long it would take him to possess another body and come after them. They had learned that this time varied a lot from lich to lich while researching the topic, ranging from a few hours to several days. Considering how good Quatakikal was, they should probably assume it was the shorter option. After hurriedly breaking into the time magic research facility beneath Cyoria, they asked Guardian of the Threshold about the crown and dagger they had newly acquired. They quickly found out that they had guessed correctly. The crown gave the controller the ability to place temporary markers on people, bringing them into the time loop for a limited time, while the dagger gave the controller an ability to place a special kind of marker on a soul of the target, letting the time loop know it should not recreate their soul in future restarts. Soul kill, as Red Robe called it. Just like the orb and the ring, both items also had a mundane function that even normal people could use. The crown acted as a personal mana storage, which they already knew thanks to Quatakikal, but it was nice to have confirmation anyway. In particular, Quatakikal's story had not made it clear whether the amount of personal mana stored in the crown was proportional to the one using it or fixed. Now they knew it was fixed in size. For Quatakikal this gave him 10 times more mana reserves than he usually had, but for Zorian it would be far more since his reserves were relatively tiny in comparison. Though it would also take him forever to fully fill up the crown as well. As for the dagger, it had the ability to cut that which cannot be cut. Or to put it more plainly, it could hurt immaterial spirits. An ability that was probably far more impressive in the distant past, when spirits were around every corner and a pissed-off god could send their servants to mess you up at any time. These days its base ability was of dubious usefulness. Upon leaving the time magic research facility, they temporarily set the dagger aside and started feverishly tinkering with the crown, trying to figure how to activate its ability to place temporary markers while sending urgent messages to every member of their little conspiracy. Thankfully, by now they had a fair bit of experience in making Imperial artifacts work, so after a few hours they succeeded in figuring out how the crown worked. And then they got to work. By now, a whole throng of people had gathered around them. It was not just people like Alanik, Svim, Silverlake and Diamond that were there. There were also various teachers from the academy, some of whom Zorian was familiar with, Ilsa, Nora and Kiran, and some of whom he wasn't, but which Svim assured him were dependable and could be counted on. Kerma, Torin and several other select members of Damon's team were also there, as was his fiancée Orissa and some of the members of her house. Many Arania were also scattered about, hailing from the Silent Doorway adepts, luminous advocates, filigree sages and others that Zorian felt could be helpful and wouldn't freak out. Lukav was also here, as were some other people that Alanik had vouched for. While Zack and Zorian had been running around Blantyr, planning how to beat Quatakikl and scouting out the Solrotham in the Ziggurat of the Sun, their fellow conspirators had been tasked with gathering all these people and informing them about the time loop. Thus, everyone here knew what they were dealing with. They did not necessarily believe in this crazy story, but that didn't really matter because seeing was believing. The restart was soon going to end, and then they would experience the truth firsthand. Zorian steeled himself a little and went out to face the crowd around them. Zorian, what the hell happened to your arm? Taven asked him with a horrified expression. It doesn't matter, he said, waving her off with his one remaining hand. I'll get it back soon, as good as new. So, said Zack happily. Who wants to be first?